Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let's pray. Gracious God, speak to us. That we may know you. Reveal yourself to us. That we may know you. Love us, that we may know you. And in knowing you, we may believe that you are God. Amen. Amen. Well, thanks for coming back after hopefully no heretical things were spoken last week. But we did engage the creeds, in particular the Nicene Creed, with a sense of music and art and the mystical intentionality of what it means to engage a belief in God. We cannot exhaustively name who God is. We cannot exhaustively understand and apprehend who God is, because we say that God is ineffable mystery. We say that yet God is revealing God's self to us all along throughout the history of creation. And our words are imperfect. Nevertheless, we say the creed is a part of our worship, as part of our practice, not just because it's canonically directed for us to do so, which it is on page 358 of the prayer book, if you're interested. We say it on Sundays and major feast days. But we say it because it's our best working hypothesis of who we understand God to be, and in doing so, we take our place in something that's 20 centuries long in the making and continues on. We are part of that tradition, and the Nicene Creed enables us to do that. Some of the elements will stop us short. We'll tease out some of those with each other today, and how shall we deal with them? And yet we also, in our great Anglican tradition, understand that controversy is what we are invited to wrestle with, and we don't all have to agree on everything to hold the space of being community. I hope that we can undergird that belief with everything that we're dealing with the creeds. And I believe that there is this rich tradition which we are being invited into when we do say the creeds. A creed, just by way of brief summary, is a statement of shared beliefs of a religious community in the form of fixed formula summarizing core tenets of belief. It's what a creed is. But I would also maintain and propose to you that we all have creeds in our lives, whether we believe it or not, whether we are willing to acknowledge that or not. We develop creeds as a way of making sense of our lives. In families, we have creeds. In work, we have creeds. In patriotic nationalism, we have creeds. In the ways that we engage our worldview, we have creeds. And religious creeds are one subset of that. And we, in the Christian tradition, hold fast to that because it helps us understand who we are. Last week I talked about the challenge for many of us is that we, in modernity, often confuse pluralism with relativism. And I got a few quizzical looks, or maybe skeptical looks of that. So let me just briefly unpack a little more about what I mean, with no accusation about any individual, but to say that in modernity, relativism relies on a taxonomy of truth aimed toward certitude. That we keep on parsing it out, and we will eventually arrive at something. And if I arrive at it before you do, my truth is more significantly accurate than yours is. That's relativism. Confused with and juxtaposed to pluralism, which is not interested in certitude so much as it is in the self-reflective exercise of what it is that I believe and can hold the space for someone else to believe differently. I believe strongly that if we are to make sense of our pluralistic world in the 21st century and beyond, we have to hold on to strong creedal statements. Because without that, it's not about certitude, but without that sense of understanding in our own right, we have a tough time understanding and respecting others as well. So relativism versus pluralism We want to hold on to pluralism. But it can't be the cerebral exercise aimed at certitude. It will just be an unsatisfying exercise for us. As I said, it's a working hypothesis. We're never going to apprehend God in all that we do. It invites us into this great tradition that we've talked about, and it invites us into mystery. And there's the piece about the Nicene Creed. It will never tease out all of who God is, nor will any other creed for us. If we then overlay our Anglican vocation onto it, our vocation is one in which we don't have to have dogmatic certitude in order to live together. We don't have to have uniformity of understanding about who God is in order to live together. In fact, we say just the opposite. We are richer as an Anglican tradition because of the plurality of understanding, of revelation that comes and is willing to be honored. We do that not just with understanding about who God is, but how creation works as well. We don't have to have it all figured out. The great traditional phrasing then is lex orandi, lex credendi. Literally, law of praying, law of believing. But what it means is we practice our faith long before we're able to assimilate it in a belief statement sort of way. But the belief statements as doctrinal teachings undergird the practice, the rule of praying, the practice of praying, which is our common prayer methodology. It undergirds that so that over time we can ascribe to, we can wrestle with, we can harangue with one another, and yet hold the space that if on a given day Scott is able to say the words of the Nicene Creed, a particular phrase, and it just doesn't make sense to me, that I can climb on the communal presence of Scott, my brother, and climb on his piggyback and know that I say the words on behalf of a community much bigger than myself, or vice versa. Some days I'm able to assent to the beliefs, some days I struggle with them, and yet we say them because it's our practice of prayer. And it's we believe in God, not we believe that God, or we believe God, We believe in God. You can't believe in something without having a relationship with that, right? If I believe in Betsy's commitment to nuclear disarmament and world peace, that's a plug for the book she's got coming out. If I believe in that, I believe in Betsy's cause, Betsy's commitment to that. Now, I might believe the statements that she says, or maybe not, but I believe in her heartfelt commitment to that. Does that make sense? So we believe in God is a very different statement than we believe that God, We say the creeds even if our belief isn't there yet or on a particular day. We say them together because we're not a confessional church. We're not a dogmatic church. We hold the space for us to wrestle with it, and yet we practice. So what is our practice here? We say the Nicene Creeds, the Nicene Creed at Principal Eucharist on Sundays and on major feast days. At the 9 o'clock, we say a variant form of the Nicene Creed that was authorized for use by our General Convention of the Episcopal Church 21 years ago, 1997. It has more expansive language, trying to remove some of the challenging masculine pronouns, particularly for the Spirit. And it also restores the Holy Spirit to the original Christian and still Eastern understanding that Spirit is in the equal partnership in the Trinity. The filioque clause, if you've ever heard that term. That's a whole other class sometime. We're not going to do that. So here's part of the rub, and we're kind of peeling the onion back, getting to a point where we're going to wrestle with the creed and see what resonates for you and what stops you short. And we'll have some conversation here in a moment on that. But the creeds, part of the challenge is that they were developed by early church councils who were thoroughly versed in Greek philosophical thought, and so many of the statements they're drawing on biblical understanding of who God is, but they're interpreting the understanding of who God is through the lens of Greek philosophy, philosophical thought. And for many of us in modernity, it just stops us short. We'll unpack that in a few minutes together. But we still, if we're able to parse out, the realities are still there in the creed. That it says that God is the creator of all. That Jesus came as the Christ, the anointed one of God, the only Son of God. We can unpack that too. That comes to offer, to mediate salvation to the whole world, including you and me. Salvation literally means just wholeness. It's one of those churchy terms that gets a lot of baggage for us. But it just means, how are we made whole? And Jesus offers us that way. And then thirdly, the creed offers the Spirit's statements about the Spirit's work in the world and our worldview, how we understand the world to operate in our Christian worldview. The Nicene Creed was written in 325, but not solidified till 381 at the Council of Constantinople. Nicaea is in present-day Turkey. The present-day town or city is called Iznik. At the heart of the question of what happened. So let me just unpack briefly. So Constantine, the emperor, the Roman emperor, has converted to Christianity about 10 years earlier, right? But he didn't quite have it all sorted out about what this Christianity is. And there's a whole lot of bickering going on among leaders in the church, especially in the East, in Egypt, wrapping around to what we know as Turkey, Asia Minor, and into Greece. Lots of bickering about what is our understanding of who God is, who Jesus Christ is, and so forth. And so he says, I got to get you all together, meaning the bishops of the church. Pulls together, I think it was about 300 bishops. Well, let's just name it, they were all men. And they didn't quite know how to converse very well with one another. There were a lot of challenges to one another's statements. And Constantine declares that the others are bishops for the church, and he's the bishop for the world. And so he chairs the Nicene Council, the Council of Nicaea in 325. So there's this overlay of political machinations going on as well. He understands we need to have Christianity have really kind of one form if we're going to keep the peace here. And so the Arian Christians, the ones who are questioning exactly what is the personhood of Jesus. Is he the Son of God? Is he God? Is he a divine figure? Is he not divine? Is he human? All of those things are wrapped up in this challenge of this council. And Constantine's trying to figure out how to keep the peace. Well, the way they kept the peace was that they pushed the Arian Christians out. And Athanasian Christians said, here is who God is, here is who Jesus is, here is who the Spirit is. And on your handout, on one side of the page, on the Council of Nicaea left-hand column, that's the creed that they developed in 325. Now you'll see that's not as replete as the one that we have today, right? Because in 381, the bishops at that point, obviously a whole new generation of bishops, come together in Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, and they work out more defining statements about the nature of God. And so if you look on the right-hand side, they still call it the Nicene Creed because it was developed off of the 325 document. But it didn't get filled out to the thing that we recognize until, 56 years later. Does that make sense? How does that sit with you? How does that feel? That it was a work in progress and that politics were involved. Karen?
Well, it feels like that the people from power were deciding what the beliefs were, whereas what we understand Jesus is coming from the powerless, and so it undoubtedly skews it a bit.
Yeah, so these were certainly the people in power making the decisions about what this creed would look like, whereas Jesus was interested in coming from the place of servanthood, and they didn't quite sort that out in the same way. That's not to say that there weren't very godly men involved, of course, but it was a power struggle for sure. Kathy?
Well, in some ways, it's sort of like the Episcopal Church and the General Convention. How long does it take us?
It's in some ways like the Episcopal Church and the General Convention, and I say amen, sister. Dennis, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, well, just to point out that we address the Creator God in one single sentence.
Yeah.
It takes 6 to explain who Jesus is. And then the Holy Spirit gets 3.
Yeah. So that's actually a good segue then to my next slide, which is, what are the questions that the Nicene Creed is trying to answer? The first one is, what is the general nature of God that has been communicated to us? And if you want to overlay this with our catechism that's in your Book of Common Prayer, kind of our statements of belief that get fleshed out more, speaks of God the Creator, God the Redeemer, God the Sanctifier, not one, another, but all of those things being bound up by the nature of who God is. And we get the statement, God the Creator of everything, visible, invisible, seen, unseen, light from light, and so forth. Then the next 5 bullets are, what is the relationship, Jesus' relationship to God? Was Jesus an actual historical human being? Did Jesus actually suffer and die? Is Jesus' death the end of the story? And how shall we be saved? And again, salvation is to be made whole. If you look at the creed, you can parse out how those are the questions that are being answered. That there were challenges in early Christianity to say, he wasn't really ever human. There were challenges to say that he didn't really die, that he was just thought to be dead, but he kept on breathing, they just didn't notice it. And you see the folly of those sorts of trajectories. And so the creed, the people who are developing the creed are trying to name, no, he died. And we can only understand resurrection if he died. And we can only understand salvation if he's human. And we can only understand redemption if he's God. And then we back ourselves maybe into what feels like a little bit of a corner, because how do we make sense of a person being human and God, which is what the creed claims. That's what we all as Trinitarian Christians are laying claim to. But there's a range of ways to unpack that in ways that we can make sense of it. And that's what I want to do some more here in just a moment. And then lastly, the third section, what is the Holy Spirit, or who is the Holy Spirit? And a few other things talking about baptism, the role of baptism, and forgiveness, and resurrection, and hope. Because those are the things that help us frame our worldview. We're not just driven off of what anything goes about what's going on in society today. We've got those bedrock understandings of our worldview in order to make sense of the world. Tim?
Just curious, in the original 325, there's no mention of Pontius Pilate. Is that because Constantine is the ruler of Rome and doesn't want, Christ is killed by the Romans?
So the question is, in the original creed from 325, there's no mention of Pontius Pilate. And was that because Constantine was involved and the Romans maybe didn't want it? It's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. Does any other Christian historical buffs know the answer? It makes a good sense that might be partly in play. There's also a real sense by the 3rd century that this is no longer a Jewish sect, Christianity. It is thoroughly the religion of the empire, And so to frame it in the context of the Romans being responsible, at least partly, for his death may have been problematic, but eventually we understand that that's really the case. Yeah.
My understanding is that because there were people who were doubting that Jesus had existed, died, and rose again, because it was a long time past, that there were anchors being placed in history. Pontius Pilate was a person of record. And so they're trying to
It's a great point, too.
to the historical.
Yeah. So Vicki makes the great point that now, 300 years later, after Jesus walked the face of the earth, people are wondering, did this person ever really exist? Has anyone else ever thought that too? You know, what is the quest of the historical Jesus? Albert Schweitzer wrote that great book just 100 years ago. We still wonder that question. And one of the ways to frame the creedal statements is to make historical markers laid down. We know that Pontius Pilate was a person from Roman history that was in Palestine at the time. So forth. Thank you. All right, so I'm assuming that I'm not the only one who struggles with some of the statements of the creed. So let me unpack one with you, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to your partner next to you and unpack a little more. I'm going to ask the question, what resonates with you? So find something that you really resonate with in the creed, and then also what you might have discomfort with, if you do. But this, you'll maybe recognize Botticelli's famous painting of the Annunciation from late 15th century, early 16th century maybe. And what we know is when we say that he was born of the Virgin Mary, that's an important statement in the history of Christianity, but we have to unpack what it means to talk about a virgin birth. Certainly Matthew's Gospel in chapter 1 and Luke's Gospel both speak of the angel appearing to Mary and of her being great with child before she had relations with Joseph, and uses the word virgin. In the Greek it's parthenos, in the Hebrew it's alma. Neither the Hebrew understanding of the word alma nor the Greek word parthenos has anything to do with sexual relations. It literally defines a woman, usually a young woman, who is of childbearing age. They're referring back to a passage from Isaiah, 8 centuries earlier, first Isaiah, who is saying, behold, a virgin, a young woman, capable of bearing a child, because she's of childbearing age, doesn't say anything about sexual relations. Behold, Isaiah says, a virgin, a young woman, shall conceive and bear a son, and he will be named Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. It was the hope of Isaiah prophetically saying to the ancient Israelites, God is going to come again into this challenging time. And Matthew and Luke both pick that up and overlay this understanding. Matthew claims the word Emmanuel for Jesus. And Luke picks up the Annunciation scene that the angel comes. And yet, by early on in the Christian tradition, we are overlaying this understanding that sexual relations can't be a part of this, because that's how we can understand, one, that he's both man or human and God, but also because we get fixated, we the church get fixated on the notion of sexual relations and the role it plays in sin, and the role it plays in understanding who women are in the world. And neither of those are really helpful at all. But they are a part of our tradition, right? So we early on understand, it's the ancient Near East understanding that in the sexual relation, it's the semen that produces the human. It's not, they didn't have any understanding of ova or egg and semen coming together, sperm coming together and making a human. They thought the man was delivering all of the constitutional element to them. So that's one. It was understanding, not just for Christians, but it was that was the understanding of the world. It was clearly wrong, right? But then overlaying on that is this notion, Thomas Aquinas is probably the most eloquent in it, 1,000 years, 1,100 years later, who says that original sin is the result of semen. That semen carries with it original sin. It's messy. I did not mean that. Paul's letters were written before Matthew's and Luke's Gospels were. There's no mention in Paul's letters about virgin birth in the way we understand virgin. There's clearly divinity attributed to Jesus. But there is not this development of there can't be sexual relations. And if you can understand what we translate virgin as being young woman of childbearing age, it leaves open the possibility that she had a conception without relations. And I believe that mystery is possible. But it also holds open the possibility that that means something else for us as well. And in modernity, we can wrestle with that. Does this make sense? Now, with the camera rolling, let me say, I am not telling you that the virgin birth is not true. I believe it's true. I believe it's mystery. I cannot explain it in clinical terms as a physician. Nor do I think that that's the objective that we have today. Can we hold the prospect that Mary said yes to God, however that came about, said yes to God, and raised a child, Jesus, who was so remarkably in tune with who God called him to be, that his life changed the world. I believe in that. I believe in the statements that the Creed has. Does this make sense? All right. So let's take 5 minutes. Turn to your neighbor. Identify one thing that resonates with you, and then one thing that wrestles with you, that you wrestle with. All right? And do about 2 minutes and then switch. So let's come on back. Let's come back. Would anyone like to share what one element resonates with you? Not that there's only one, but an element that resonates. Anyone? Maris?
So I always kind of tear up about the Holy Spirit in this reading, in this writing, and in the Holy Ghost, the Lord, the giver of life. That phrase always touches my heart. And I think part of that is because I feel like the Holy Spirit is possibly the most intuitive way that I personally experience God. So it's a proof.
Yeah, thank you. So Maris was saying that she sometimes even tears up on the statement, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, and that perhaps the Spirit is the most intuitive way of engaging the Creed or even God. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you for that. Is that true for anyone else? That the Spirit is resonant? Yeah. Penny?
Yeah, I've always had trouble with it. We acknowledge our baptism for forgiveness of sins, because that implies original sin.
So, let me clarify. You're jumping now to what you have problems with, not the what resonates with you. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. And then she says, I have problems with, we acknowledge one baptism for the forgiveness of sins because it implies original sin. All right. I'm the one who opened Pandora's box by stating original sin. It is more than we can unpack here in this class. Can we at least acknowledge that we all have the capacity for sin? Forget about original sin for a moment. it's a messy, it's messy. There's important value there, but I'll teach another class some other time on that. I'll think about doing that. But can we all agree that we all have the capacity for sin? And then can we all agree that we all have the need for forgiveness of our sins? And do we all recognize that baptism in our tradition is a ritual by which we understand many things, including the state of forgiveness because of the relationship that is forged in baptism with who God is through Jesus Christ? That's a big statement. But can we acknowledge that baptism is an important way we understand forgiveness of sins? Then set aside, if you can, the notion of original sin with all of its stickiness, and just know that we hold fast to this tradition of baptism. It's why we're doing this new font here next month. And it's why we encourage families to bring their babies to be baptized. It's not that we say that that baby is bad, but that we all know what it is to be broken. And that in that ritual we come to understand grace mediated by God as renewing, as relieving, as the experience of forgiveness. That's what that phrase means. So thanks for raising it. Anyone else want to say anything about resonating before we move to problematic? There's a lot of hands that go down there and resonate up there. Yeah. Tim, one more.
I want to go back to something on Pontius Pilate because he was executed by the powers that be as a criminal, primarily because of his concern for the poor. And that to me resonates today forever.
It resonates to name Pontius Pilate because he was executed by the powers that be as a common criminal, and he did so in the context of service to the poor. Is that Scott? One more and then we'll move.
Right, so the opening sentence is what resonates with me. We live with God the Father, the Almighty Maker of heaven and earth, and all that seen and unseen. If you believe that, then the rest of it's not a problem.
Yeah, it's there, right?
Right.
Because that's not, yeah, sorry.
Either he's omnipotent or he's not. If he is, then all things are possible.
Creator of everything, and if that first statement makes sense, then everything else can follow from it. Okay? Yeah, good. All right, Russ, one more.
I like the Bloedel of the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Because it's forward thinking, something that is really steeped in history.
Life of the resurrection and the hope of the world to come, because they're forward thinking, which is, again, worldview for Christians. We can't make sense of this world if we're only focused on what has been and what is. We also have this forward thinking because God is up to something with us in this world. Now, let's unpack one or two of problematic. Kathy, you've just been dying, so go ahead.
I agree, actually, with the resonating was my first sentence, but
Could you speak up a little?
I've always been mystified by the fact that there is nothing about what he did on earth, all the good that he did.
Yeah.
You know, why isn't there a sentence about that? Now I'm thinking maybe it's because this is all about the mystical side of things. But
So Kathy's naming the challenge doesn't really speak much about what Jesus accomplished on earth in his ministry, and very legitimate critique, and one that Christians throughout the ages have really wrestled with. There's not a good explanation for it, except that when these creeds were written, they were focused on how did he get to earth, how did he get off of earth, and what does that mean for us on earth. But we do great peril to our faith journey if we don't consider who Jesus the person was.